The air inside Melody Makers was thick and quiet like a library. It smelled strongly of lemon-scented polish and rich, dark wood. This was not a place for loud noises or quick movements. It was a temple for music, and everything in it was expensive and delicate. Standing in the middle of the store was a man named Alistair. He wore a suit that fit him perfectly, a suit that cost more than some people's monthly rent. His shoes were so shiny you could almost see your face in them. His mind, however, was not on the beautiful instruments around him. It was on a big business deal happening later that day. The phone in his pocket kept buzzing, a constant reminder of the important world he lived in. He was at the counter looking at 2 violin bows. They were both beautiful, made from a special kind of wood. One had a mother-of-pearl inlay. He was trying to decide which one his daughter would like more. His daughter had everything she could ever want, but he liked to give her the best. As he held the bows, feeling their weight, his thoughts were already in a tall glass building in a meeting room with a large table. His quiet thinking was suddenly broken by a sharp voice. It was one of the store clerks, a young man with glasses. "You. I told you you can't be in here." Alistair sighed, a small sound of annoyance. He looked in the direction the clerk was shouting. Over in a corner near a huge black concert grand piano was a young woman trying to become invisible. She was small and looked like she was carrying her whole life in a large worn-out backpack. Her clothes were dirty and a bit too big for her. She was hiding in the shadows of the piano, probably just trying to get in from the cold city streets for a few minutes. The clerk, his face red with embarrassment and anger, started walking quickly towards her. "I've warned you before, out now!" The young woman flinched, pulling her arms tight around herself. She didn't argue. She just started to move, ready to go back out into the cold. For a reason he didn't fully understand, Alistair felt a sudden, small pinch of something in his chest. It wasn't kindness, not really. It was more like a mix of pity and a feeling of being bothered by the scene. He held up a hand, stopping the clerk. "Wait," Alistair said. The clerk paused and looked at him, confused. Alistair turned his attention to the young woman. She looked down at the floor, refusing to meet his eyes. He wasn't looking at her as a person, but as a problem that was wasting his precious time. A thought popped into his head, a silly idea that he found amusing. He wouldn't just give her money. He would make a little game out of it. A small, condescending chuckle escaped his lips. He pointed a well-manicured finger towards the magnificent piano she had been hiding near. It was a beautiful, monstrous thing, its lid propped open like the wing of a giant black bird. "Tell you what," Alistair said, his voice dripping with a sense of his own importance. He spoke slowly, as if talking to a child. "If you can play the piano," he said, pausing for effect, "I will feed you." He said the last part with a smile, as if he had just offered her $1 million. In his mind, it was a harmless joke. She would mumble something, maybe look ashamed, and then leave. The clerk would be happy. The disturbance would be over, and he could get back to choosing his violin bow. He fully expected her to shrink away from the challenge. After all, what could a homeless girl possibly know about playing an instrument that cost more than a car? The whole situation to him was just a small, slightly amusing interruption in his otherwise important day. He waited, his eyebrows slightly raised for her to admit defeat and leave. The man's words hung in the air between them. "I will feed you." He said it like it was a great prize, a generous offer from a king to a beggar. For a long second, nothing happened. The store clerk shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking deeply uncomfortable. He just wanted the girl out. The well-dressed man, Alistair, kept his slight, confident smile. He was already moving on in his mind, his attention starting to drift back to the violin bows on the counter. This little scene was almost over, but then the girl moved. She didn't look at the man. She didn't look at the clerk. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the floor, slowly lifted and landed on the grand piano. It was as if the rest of the world had faded away, and only the instrument existed. There was no anger in her face, no shame. Instead, there was a strange, deep focus that seemed out of place on someone so young and in such a difficult situation. She took a small step forward, then another. Her movements were quiet, hesitant, but there was a purpose to them that made the clerk stop his nervous fidgeting. Alistair's smile began to fade, replaced by a flicker of confusion. This was not the reaction he had expected. He thought she would run away. He thought she would hang her head and leave. He never, for a single moment, thought she would actually approach the piano. She walked right up to the magnificent instrument. She stood beside it for a moment, her head slightly bowed, not touching it. She just looked at it as if she were greeting an old friend she hadn't seen in many years. The polished black wood reflected a distorted image of her small, shabby frame. She didn't sit on the plush velvet-covered bench. It was as if she felt her clothes were too dirty, that she wasn't worthy of such a comfortable seat. Instead, she positioned herself right in front of the keys, standing up. Alistair watched, his business deal and the violin bows now completely forgotten. A part of him felt a sudden cold worry. What was she doing? Was she going to damage this incredibly expensive piano? He almost took a step forward to stop her, but something in her posture held him back. He saw her hands then. They were small and looked fragile. There was dirt under her fingernails. They were the hands of someone who had been living a very hard life. But as she slowly raised them, hovering just above the row of white and black keys, he noticed something else. Her fingers, though dirty, were long and slender. They held a certain grace, a readiness that was impossible to fake. She closed her eyes. She took a deep, slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling. The entire store was silent. You could hear the faint hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic from outside. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath with her. Then her fingers came down. The first sound was not a simple, clumsy note. It wasn't the plunk of a child's finger hitting a key. It was a chord, a rich, complex, and deeply sad sound that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. It was a sound that was too big, too beautiful to come from this small, ragged person standing before the piano. Alistair felt the air leave his lungs. His mouth, which had been so ready to chuckle, was now slightly open in pure shock. The clerk, who had been so impatient, was frozen, his eyes wide. And then, the music began to flow. It was a piece by Chopin, a nocturne. It was not a simple song. It was a river of emotion, full of gentle waves and sudden, powerful currents. Her fingers, those dirty, slender fingers, danced across the keys. They didn't just press the notes. They seemed to caress them, to pull the music out of the piano. The music was soft, then strong, then soft again. It was lonely and beautiful all at once. It told a story of lost things and quiet hopes. It was the kind of music that you hear in grand concert halls, played by people who have spent their entire lives practicing. Alistair stood absolutely still. He was a man who went to fancy charity concerts. He owned expensive headphones and listened to classical music in his car. He thought he knew what good music sounded like. But this was different. This wasn't just technical skill, though the skill was undeniable. This was something else. This was feeling. This was a soul pouring itself out through its fingertips. He looked at the girl's face. Her eyes were still closed. A single tear had escaped and was tracing a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. She was somewhere else entirely, lost in the world she was creating. The music filled every corner of the quiet store. It wrapped around Alistair, and for the first time that day he wasn't thinking about his phone, his meeting, or the violin bows. He was only listening. The cynical, proud man who had made a joke of this girl just minutes ago was gone. In his place was a man who was being humbled. He was being humbled by the sheer, unexpected, and breathtaking beauty that was coming from someone he had judged so quickly and so poorly. He had thrown out a silly challenge to get rid of a nuisance. But the nuisance had turned out to be a musician, and the joke, he was starting to realize, was entirely on him. The music did not simply stop. It seemed to dissolve, the last note hanging in the air for a long moment, a ghost of the beautiful sadness that had just filled the room. Then there was only silence. It was a heavy, deep silence, so complete that it felt louder than the music itself. The girl's hands slowly lowered from the keys. She kept her head down, her shoulders slumping forward as if the effort of playing had taken all the energy she had left in her body. She wiped her cheek quickly with the back of her hand, smearing the path the single tear had made. She did not look at the two men. She just stood there waiting, as if she had returned from a long journey to a place she did not want to be. The store clerk was the first to move. He blinked several times as if waking up from a dream. He looked from the girl to the expensive piano, almost as if he were checking it for damage. But there was no damage. The piano seemed to glow, still vibrating with the memory of the song. The clerk's face, which had been so hard and impatient before, was now soft with wonder. He looked at the girl not as a problem, but as a person he could not understand. Alistair, however, had not moved a muscle. He was still standing in the exact same spot, his briefcase hanging limply from his hand. The confident, slightly arrogant man from a few minutes ago was gone. In his place was a man whose mind had been completely emptied. All his thoughts about mergers, stock prices, and important meetings had been wiped clean. The only thing left inside his head was the echo of that music. He stared at the girl. He really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. He saw the frayed edges of her coat, the way her hair was matted and unwashed. But he also saw the delicate shape of her hands now hanging quietly at her sides. He saw the quiet dignity in her posture, even in her shame. The contradiction was staggering. How could someone who looked like she had nothing produce something so full of beauty and soul? His own words echoed in his ears, and they sounded so ugly to him now. "If you can play the piano, I will feed you." He had said it with a chuckle. He had treated her like a stray animal he could tempt with a scrap of food. He felt a hot wave of shame wash over him, so powerful it made his face feel warm. He, a man who prided himself on being smart and perceptive, had been utterly, completely blind. He had been ready to judge a book by its torn and dirty cover, without ever imagining the masterpiece that was written inside. He finally took a breath, a deep one, as if he had forgotten to breathe during the entire performance. The sound of his own inhalation seemed loud in the quiet room. He needed to say something. He needed to break this silence, but what could he possibly say? "That was nice?" It would be an insult. "You play well?" It was a ridiculous understatement. He took a small, hesitant step forward. The floorboard creaked under his expensive shoe, and the girl flinched slightly, still not looking at him. "That," he began, but his voice came out as a dry croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "That was incredible." The words felt weak and useless, but they were all he had. He wasn't a man who was often at a loss for words, but now he felt like he had no language to describe what he had just experienced. The girl finally lifted her head. She looked at him, and for a brief second their eyes met. He saw no pride in her eyes, no satisfaction at having proven him wrong. He saw only a deep, tired sadness and a flicker of fear, as if she expected him to be angry. This look pierced his heart more deeply than the music had. He had not just underestimated a talent. He had misjudged a human being. The clerk finally found his voice, speaking in a hushed, reverent tone. I've never heard anything like that in here," he whispered. "And we get some good players." This comment from the clerk seemed to break the spell a little. Alistair's mind, which was so good at solving problems and making plans, suddenly kicked into gear. The initial shock was turning into a burning, urgent curiosity. Who was she? Where did she come from? How did a young girl living on the streets learn to play like a world-class pianist? The questions tumbled over each other in his head. He looked at the girl, really looked at her, and he knew that a hot meal was not the answer. It was a start, but it was not nearly enough. The challenge was over. His flippant promise had been fulfilled the moment her fingers touched the keys. But he knew with a certainty that surprised him that he could not just pay for some food and walk away. He couldn't go back to his important meeting and his violin bows. Not now. Not after this. The world outside the music store, the world of his phone buzzing and his busy schedule, seemed distant and unimportant. A much more pressing matter was standing right in front of him. He made a decision. It was a quick one, and it was not based on business logic or personal gain. It was based on a feeling, a need to make right a wrong he had not even known he was committing. He looked at the girl, his expression now soft and serious. The last traces of the chuckling executive were gone. "I meant what I said," he told her, his voice gentle but firm. "I will get you something to eat, but would you please tell me your name?" The silence in the car was heavy and uncomfortable. It was not the peaceful quiet of the music store after the girl had finished playing. This was different. The girl sat as far away from the man as she could, pressed against the passenger door, her large backpack clutched tightly on her lap like a shield. She stared out the window at the passing buildings, her body tense and ready to run. The man, Alistair, drove carefully. He didn't turn on the radio. He didn't make a phone call. He could feel the fear coming from her in waves. He understood it. He was a stranger, a man in an expensive car, and she was completely in his power. He kept his hands visible on the steering wheel and tried to make himself seem as small and non-threatening as possible. He didn't take her to a fancy restaurant. He knew that would be too much, too intimidating. Instead, he pulled up in front of a small, quiet cafe he sometimes visited alone. It was a warm, simple place with soft lighting and booths that offered privacy. Would this be okay? He asked, his voice softer than he usually used. The girl glanced at the cafe door and gave a tiny, almost invisible nod. Inside, he led her to a booth in the back corner. She slid into the seat, still holding her backpack. A waitress came over, smiling warmly. She placed 2 menus on the table. The girl didn't touch hers. She just looked at the tabletop, tracing a small scratch in the wood with her finger. "Are you hungry?" Alistair asked. "You can have anything you like." Anything at all, she didn't look up. "Just some soup, please," she whispered. Her voice was so quiet he had to lean forward to hear it. It was the first time he had heard her speak. Her voice was gentle, with a slight tremor. He ordered a bowl of chicken soup and a grilled cheese sandwich for her, and a black coffee for himself. When the food arrived, the smell seemed to break through her walls. She looked at the steaming bowl as if it were a mirage. She hesitated for a moment, then picked up the spoon with a hand that shook slightly. She ate slowly at first, then with a deep, focused hunger that was painful to watch. She was trying to be polite, but her body was desperate for the warm, simple food. Alistair sipped his coffee and waited. He didn't ask any questions. He just let her eat. He noticed how she tried to hide her eagerness, how she wiped her mouth carefully with the napkin. These small signs of a past life, of someone who had once known manners and comfort, made his heart ache. When she had eaten about half of the soup and sandwich, she seemed to relax, just a little. The warmth of the food was doing its work. She leaned back against the booth, her shoulders losing some of their tightness. Alistair saw his chance. He didn't want to scare her, but he needed to know. "The music you played," he began, choosing his words with great care. It was Chopin, wasn't it? The Nocturne in C-sharp minor?" Her eyes flickered up to meet his for a second, surprise in them. She nodded slowly. "How did you learn to play like that?" he asked. It wasn't just learning, it was like you felt every single note. He was afraid she would shut down. But instead, she looked down at her hands, now resting on the table. They were clean where they had held the spoon, but the dirt was still etched around her nails and in the lines of her skin. "My mother," she said, her voice still a whisper. "She was a piano teacher." A ghost of a smile touched her lips, there and gone in an instant. "Our whole apartment was always full of music. She started teaching me when I was 4. She said I had good ears." She fell silent, and Alistair didn't push. He just waited. "The piano was my whole world," she continued, almost talking to herself. "I practiced for hours. I got into a special music school. My teachers said I could. They said I had a future." The hope in her voice was a sad, broken thing. "Then what happened?" Alistair asked gently. The light in her eyes died. "There was a car accident 2 years ago. They were both gone. My mother and my father." She said it flatly, as if she had recited these words many times in her head, and all the pain had been worn smooth by repetition. She explained in broken pieces what happened next. No other family. She was still a minor. She went into the system for a while, but it was loud and chaotic, and there was no piano. She ran away. She had been on her own since then, moving from place to place, trying to stay out of sight. She stayed in shelters when she could, but they scared her. She felt safer sometimes on the streets than in some of those places. "The piano," she said, her voice cracking. "It's the only thing I have left of her. The only thing that still feels like home. When I saw that store, I just wanted to be near one. For a minute. I didn't mean to cause trouble." Alistair listened. He listened to every word. He was a man who sat in meetings where people talked about millions of dollars and complex contracts. But he had never listened to anything as closely as he was listening to this girl's story. He felt a weight of sadness and responsibility settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just a homeless person. This was a child. A talented, grieving child who had lost everything and had been surviving in a world that had no place for her. He finally understood. The music in the store wasn't a performance. It was a memory. It was a prayer. It was the sound of a girl reaching back through time to touch the only thing she had ever truly loved. He looked at her, really seeing her now not as a project or a puzzle, but as a person. A person who was scared and alone and incredibly strong. He knew what he had to do. A hot meal was a single act. It was a bandage on a deep wound. It wasn't nearly enough. "Thank you," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Thank you for telling me." He paid the bill and they walked back to the car. The silence between them was different now. It wasn't filled with fear and suspicion. It was filled with a shared understanding of a story that was both terrible and beautiful. And Alistair knew his own story had just become tangled up with hers. The drive from the cafe was quiet, but the noise in the man's head was deafening. He couldn't just drop her off somewhere. The image of her going back to a cold, dark doorway was impossible to accept. He thought of his own daughter, safe and warm in her room, surrounded by everything she could ever need. The unfairness of it all felt like a physical pain in his chest. He drove to a part of the city he knew well, near a community center his company sometimes supported. He pulled up in front of a clean, well-kept building with a bright blue door. A sign out front read, "Haven for Women and Children." "This is a safe place," he said to the girl who was looking at the building with wide, uncertain eyes. "The woman who runs it, she's a good person. I know her. Let me just talk to her. You can wait here." He went inside and found the director, a kind-faced woman named Brenda who had a no-nonsense way about her. He didn't give her a long story. He simply said, "I have a young woman outside. She has no place to go. She's a piano prodigy, Brenda. She just needs a safe bed and a chance." Brenda looked at his face, saw the genuine urgency there, and nodded. "Bring her in." Getting the girl inside was the hardest part. She was terrified. But Brenda's calm and direct manner worked. "You're safe here, dear," she said, not with pity but with firm assurance. "You can have a hot shower, a clean bed, and no one will bother you. Let's get you settled." The girl, exhausted and out of options, finally agreed. She glanced back at the man once before following Brenda down a hallway, her expression a mixture of fear and a tiny, fragile spark of hope. The next day, Alistair was back in his office. The big merger was happening, but his heart wasn't in it. During a break, he stood by his huge window looking down at the city. It looked different now. He saw the hidden corners, the alleys where someone like her might be trying to sleep. He picked up his phone and scrolled through his contacts. He found a number he hadn't dialed in years. It belonged to an old friend from university, a man who was now a very respected but very strict piano professor at the city's conservatory. He called him. "Michael," he said, "I need a favor. It's a strange one." He told the professor the story. He didn't dress it up. He told him about the music store, his own stupid challenge, and the heartbreaking music that had followed. He told him about the girl's story, about her mother, about her lost future. "There's something special there, Michael," Alistair said, his voice intense. "I'm not a music expert, but I know what I heard." It wasn't just notes. It was everything. The professor was silent for a long time. "Alistair," he said finally, his voice skeptical. "You know how many talented kids there are. You know how many sad stories I hear." "I know," Alistair insisted. "But just hear her. Just once, please, as a favor to me." There was another long pause. "All right," the professor sighed. "Bring her to my studio tomorrow afternoon. But I'm not making any promises." The following day, Alistair picked the girl up from the shelter. Brenda had helped her find some clean, simple clothes. She looked younger, and the fear in her eyes had been replaced by a nervous anxiety. She didn't speak during the drive to the conservatory. The professor's studio was a small room dominated by a grand piano. The air smelled of old books and dust. The professor was a tall, serious man with glasses. He looked at the girl without smiling. "You are the one Alistair told me about?" he asked. She nodded, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "The Chopin Nocturne," he said. "Play it." It was not a request. It was a command. The girl walked to the piano. This time she sat on the bench. She took a deep breath, just like she had in the store. And then she played. It was the same piece, but it was different. Here in this room built for music, the sound was even richer, even more powerful. The same deep feeling was there, the same soul. But now, free from the fear of being thrown out, there was also a flicker of strength, a hint of the musician she could still become. Alistair watched the professor's face. At first it was neutral, critical, but as the music continued, he saw the man's stern expression soften. He saw his eyes narrow in concentration, then widen in surprise. He saw him lean forward slightly, listening not just to the notes, but to the spaces between them. When she finished, the room was silent again. The professor took off his glasses and polished them slowly, a thoughtful look on his face. He looked at the girl. "Your technique has rust. Your fingering is unconventional. You have missed years of practice." The girl's head drooped. as if expecting a final rejection. Then the professor continued, his voice quieter. But the music is still there. It is buried, but it is alive. He looked at Alistair, then back at the girl. I will take you on. We will work. It will be very, very hard. You have a long road back. It wasn't a celebration. It was a challenge. But for the first time, a real, genuine smile touched the girl's lips. It was a small thing, but it lit up her entire face. Thank you, she whispered. I will work hard. I promise. Weeks passed. Alistair made sure the girl was safe at the shelter. He worked with Brenda to make a plan. The professor was true to his word, and the girl began her lessons. She practiced for hours every day, her dedication absolute. One evening, Alistair stopped by the community center. He didn't announce himself. He walked down a hallway to a small room where he knew there was an old, slightly out-of-tune upright piano. The door was slightly open. He looked inside. The girl was there, practicing. Her back was to him. He could see her shoulders moving with the effort. She was playing scales over and over. It wasn't the beautiful, sad music from the store. It was hard, boring, repetitive work, but she was doing it. She was building her future back, one note at a time. She stopped, sighed, and then started the scale again, slower this time, focusing on getting it perfectly right. Alistair didn't go in. He didn't say a word. He just stood there and watched for a moment. He thought about the man he had been in the music store, the one who was annoyed by an interruption. That man felt like a stranger to him now. He had gone to that store to buy a piece of music history, but he had found something much more valuable. He had found a reason to look up from his phone, to listen to the world outside his own busy life. The executive who had chuckled was gone, forever changed by the quiet girl and the surprise she held in her hands. Her journey was just beginning, and in a small way, so was his.